Good evening. Happy to see all together here this evening, and hopefully everyone has had a good day. Hopefully it's been enjoyable. Tonight we are going to be talking about fairness and justice. Really, probably more fairness than justice, but we're going to be looking at the parable of the workers in the vineyard. And tonight we'll be in Matthew chapter 20. So if you want to be getting there, that'll be the bulk of our focus is Matthew chapter 20. But I want to start with a question or a comment, depending on how you want to view this. You may take it both ways. I want to start with a question. How many of you have ever uttered the statement, well, that's just not fair? Okay? From the earliest age to the oldest of age and everywhere in between, we've probably uttered the phrase or the statement, that's just not fair. Now, the reality of the statement, that's just not fair, really is the fact that the period at the end of it probably shouldn't be there. Because when we say that, what we really mean most of the time is that's just not fair to me. Because I think it should be this other way. Right? We look at things and we think about how it affects other people, but sometimes we view that more about how it affects me. Well, that doesn't seem fair. I'll tell a story from whenever I was really little. And me and my sister were in Crab Orchard, and we were taken to the store by Fred Simpson. And we were told how many things to get. We could get little prizes or whatever it was at the store. And when we came out of there, Jessica said, Daniel got 3 stuffs, and I only got 2 stuffs. Daniel was just supposed to get 2, was what Jessica said. Now, that, if you know my sister, fairness and justice, she toes that line real hard right there. But as a child, if we're taken to the store and we're told that you can get, and the other person gets 3 things, we sometimes have a hard time grasping that that's the fairness of that, right? And it would be hard to explain to a 5-year-old, well, if you add up the price of these 3 things, it equals $5. And if you add up the price of these 2 things, but that's not what we're looking at, right? We sometimes get kind of wrapped up in the fairness of things. And what we're going to look at tonight is this story, this workers in the vineyard parable, where people started to question whether or not something is really fair. And whenever we look at this story, we'll probably consider this story as being sort of unfair as well, at least when we first read it. But what we're going to work through and see is the lesson that is presented there behind it. Let's start, though, with what we've done the last few times. The first appearance we see of fairness and justice and that kind of thing, Exodus 23 and verse 2, you shall not follow a crowd to do evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after many to pervert justice. And we see the word pervert means to disrupt or to change or to knock out or whatever word you want to use right there. But this notion of sort of destroying justice and fairness, the terms that we use right here. Some Old Testament examples here. The first one, Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 15, you shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. In righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. This is a very hard sentence for us, or scripture for us many times to follow, because quite often in justice in judgment there is injustice. We can point out examples of that takes place. But the problem with that is the judgment that takes place on earth is by definition biased and partial, because it's hard to have all of the facts and information. And that becomes difficult for it. Proverbs 2:9, then you will understand righteousness and justice, equity, and every good path. The last one, Isaiah 1 and 17, learn to do good, seek justice, rebuke the oppressor, defend the fatherless, plead for the widow. So there's more examples, of course, but those are some Old Testament examples. New Testament examples, Matthew 23:23, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, For you pay the tithe of mint and anise and cumin and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. A few weeks ago, we studied about that teaching of Jesus and how he just sort of dressed down the hypocrites, the people, the scribes and Pharisees who he called hypocrites throughout Matthew chapter 23. Luke 18:7, and shall not God avenge his own elect who cry out day and night to him, though he bears along with them? And last one, what we read from just a moment ago, John 7:51, does our law judge a man before it hears him and knows what he is doing? I have that one last because I think the absolute answer for us is yes. We fall very guilty to John chapter 7 and verse 51. Do we judge a man before it hears him? When we hear something, we've not heard from the person who's accused, but we can pass that judgment real quick. Oh, I guarantee he did it, right? How many of we have ever said something like that? You know he did it. You know he did it. He's always doing something like that. We can fall into that real careful. But every law book that's ever been written requires a person to be able to give it a defense. And we don't want to hear the defense. Oh, you know, he probably just lying if he tells you whatever his defense is. We can fall into that very easy. Yeah. Yeah, that's probably not the best. You know, if you walk in if you're already putting them guilty beforehand, that's probably going to be tough. Revelation chapter 19 and verse 11. Now I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. And I think we saw righteousness just a second ago as well, but we want to make sure, you know, with judgment, we would like for there to be righteousness that is included in that as well. So today, though, we're talking about fairness and justice. This is a little, for each one of these, there's a little quote. I don't even know where these quotes come from, but they are on there. They're not cited or attributed to anything. But this one says, the most important behaviors that impede justice among children have to do with them observing the outer person rather than looking for the inner one. They may show favoritism to people with a certain appearance or set of belongings, but God wants them to look on the hearts. And that's what we talked about Sunday morning as well. But we are quick to spot this. I know this was about children, but this it happens for adults as well. We sometimes place judgment based on how things appear without attempting to sort of dive in a little bit further. Tonight we're looking at Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. But we're Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 7 to start with. This is called the parable of the workers in the vineyard. So, Boo, do you want to read the first one? Just go through verse 7. Okay, so let me start by saying I know very little about vineyards and grapes and any of that kind of stuff. All I know is you drive by it and what it kind of looks like. It seems like a lot of work, a lot of difficulty, but I don't know anything about anything when it comes to that. But this story is designed to show a need for work throughout the course of the day. Okay, and throughout the course of the day. And so we'll get to that here in just a second. But first of all, to what does Jesus liken the kingdom of heaven in this parable? What does he compare the kingdom of heaven to? The owner of the vineyard. And the owner of the vineyard needed what, Ben? He needed workers, he needed laborers. And so whenever you all utter these comments like, who wants to work today? Remember Matthew chapter 20, they were making the same complaints there, right? They needed people to work even back then. But part of the problem was that it is a difficult type of work. And so he goes out at the earliest morning and he hires some people, is it right? And so let's look at what did he do? Early in the morning, verses 1 and 2, he does what? He goes to get workers. And so let's just say early in the morning, they went out and worked. So if you go to work early in the morning, you're probably going to be there how long? You're going to be there all day. So you can fill in the blanks as to what time you think they might have started and finished, but they're going to be there a while. The second one, at the third hour of the day, what did he do? Verses 3 and 4. He went out and looked to hire more workers. Now, that's going to be a long day, right? But is it as long as the first workers were there? No, the first workers are going to work longer. What about at the 6th and 9th hours of the day? Verse 5. They went to get more workers. So they went and got more at the 6th hour, more at the 9th hour. Well, at the 6th hour, you're not working near as much as the 3rd hour and as the starting person. And at the 9th hour, you're definitely not working. And then at the 11th hour of the day, verses 6 and 7, what does the landowner do? He went out and found more workers, but they were idle, right? And they said what? What was their response when he asked them, what are you doing? Nobody's hired us. So they're there. They're ready to go here as it was. But it's the 11th hour of the day. It's almost over. It's almost quitting time. But they're still going to go out. They go out. You know, they're going to be. They're still looking for workers even at the end of time. Absolutely. So if we want to compare that to our work day, you know, Ben said 9 o'clock and noon and 3 and 5 or whatever it might be. So if you clocked in at 9, you've been there the whole time, but there's still a need for workers at 4:30 or at 5 o'clock right there. So they offer them in the story here. We're going to see about how much they are paid. But I want to ask you this. Does anybody know what a denarius is? So the denarius was I looked this up because I'm assuming that we probably don't know, and there's not going to be a test on it. But a denarius was the standard Roman silver coin. And it started as the Roman coin, from what I'd seen, about 200 BC, okay? So a couple hundred years before Christ, and it lasted to roughly 240 AD. Okay, so it lasted for about 500-ish years as the main coin. And then whoever the emperor was in 240, they kind of went away from it and went to something else there instead. The word denarius is derived from a Latin word, which meant containing a ton. That was the name that was given there. If some of you can remember, anybody take Spanish when you were in high school? Anybody take Spanish class way back when? Woo, it's been a long time ago, right? I can't remember barely remember English, much less Spanish. But Spanish, if you took Spanish in high school, the Spanish word for money is dinero, right? All right, you may have heard that. Some of you may not. It descends from the same word. If you go around much of the Arabic-speaking part of the Mediterranean, any place that you find that the people speak Arabic, which is the Middle East and some places, but mostly Northern Africa, mostly Muslim countries, the word dinar, D-I-N-A-R, is used. That's a common currency that is used as well. But it comes from there. But it's the most basic form of currency. So the only way that I wanted to maybe think about comparing this for something today was to make it real simple, just to say, at the end of the day, you're going to get $1. Okay? I would imagine most of us can probably generate $1 easier than a 5, and probably more so than a 20, and probably definitely more so than a 100, right? You know, do what now? Who wrote 32? Did you write that? That doesn't seem right, but I don't know. I wouldn't have thought so. So whatever it would be, the point of what we're looking at, though, we pay Lucille denarius here. We're going to start paying her that way. So, chicken place didn't pay you with denarii, did they, Lucille? Didn't pay her nothing, she said. Well, I'll be. All right. Well, the point of this here is it's a standard day's wage. And I don't know what that would translate over to today, market value or anything like that. But the point of it is, in the story, what we're going to see is everybody gets paid the same thing. And that'll be sort of a bone of contention for some people here as we go forward. So let's look now at Matthew chapter 20. This is verses 8 through 16. Mom, do you care to read Matthew 28 through 16? Because this is the bulk of the parable. All right, I'm going to tell you first thing. When y'all ain't looking, I'm going to go around and get every one of these old King Jameses and hide them in the back room so we can read something that makes sense to an audience listening in the year 2020. I'll say that. All right. The story here, we're going to work our way through this verses 8 through 16. So at the end of the day, and remember, at the start of the day, at the 3rd hour, the 6th hour, the 9th hour, and the 11th hour, people have been sent out to work. And when the bell rings, when it's over, he sends out his steward to do what? Time to pay. End of the day, it's time to get paid. Now, the math here would seem kind of complicated, right? We got to do the math. We got to figure out, okay, you've worked 12 hours, you've worked 9 hours, you've worked, we got to do the math on that. But that's not how the story goes. The second question here, if it'll click. How much was given to each laborer? The day's wage. So had you went out in the first crowd and you worked all day long, you got a denarius. Had you went out at any other time, worked the rest of the day, you got a denarius, or a denarii, I'd say is probably what the plural is right there. And then if you went out in the 11th hour, if you were the last one hired, one of those that was standing around idle, you got what? The same price. All right. You got the same wage. Right. All right. So immediately for us, we almost immediately think, this is not right. How many of you, when reading this story, immediately get that word in your mind? Well, that doesn't seem fair at all, right? Yeah, well, that's true. That is true. It depends on who heard it. If I could work 1 hour and make the same as you working 12, sign me up. I want in on that right there. But they were each given the same amount of pay. Now, had you been one of the early workers, you would have viewed this as quite unfair. In fact, so much is said so in the story right here. Why don't you just take? Well, all right. Invitation song will be up there on the board right there. So. True. That's true. So who complained when they received their wages? Or if you're reading something written 500 years ago, who murmured whenever they received their wages? Who was it that complained? The first group. And why did they complain? They'd been there the longest. And I want to ask you to be quite honest with me. Did they have a valid complaint? Raise their hand if you agree. Hold on. You got to realize first they're worn out. These guys are kids. Yep. So it's interesting, though, that the hands went up for almost everybody in here. Y'all don't want to hear no stories about why, right? I don't want to hear that, yeah, they agreed to it or no, they didn't. I was here for 12 hours, you was here for 12 minutes, and I got paid the same as you. I'm mad about that. Do we ever fall into that trap? We absolutely fall into it. We're going to come back to that here in just a second as well. Now, what did the landowner, the person who's got the wallet, who's writing the check, what did the landowner say to those who had complained? this is what you agreed to. He never once came and said, well, you're going to, you're working 9 hours instead of 12. And so we're going to all he said was what? I need what? I need laborers. I think every single one of the verses there, the original verse, the ninth, the third hour, the sixth hour, the ninth, I think every single one says there was a need for laborers. And so he went out and got the laborers. And so he told them, he said, this is what you agreed to. Now, at the end, they pay these people their workers. What's meant by the phrase, so the last shall be first, and the first shall be last?
Given us cause to do this work, and the first one has kind of fallen away and didn't accept Jesus Christ, and so they're going to be
okay. All right. Other thoughts on it?
Well, I think too, is, if you become a Christian when you're 15 years old, and you do everything to a lady fish, you're guilty, you're going to go to heaven. Become a Christian till you're 80 years old, and you no matter what you've done all this other time. You do everything to plan salvation, and you're 85 years old before you become a Christian. You're just as much a Christian as the people that have been.
Who worked in the fields? They all did. Every person in chapter 20 worked in the field, right? Now, did they work as long? No, but they were what was required of them, because they realized there was a need for more workers, and so they went and got more. They went and got more along the way. At the same time, that last verse says, "For many are called, but few are chosen." What is meant by this phrase?
The invitation to come to work is open to everybody. Everybody's welcome. Everyone's called, but very few will be coming in and do that work.
So I kind of read this here, and maybe I'm wrong, but whenever he went and first asked, some people went right ahead, right? But it probably would have been nice if everybody in the community would have already been there, right? But I don't know why they weren't there. Maybe they didn't get there in time. Who knows? But he needed a little more, so he called more and more there along the way. He said, "Many are called, but then few are chosen." It seems to me like there could have been more workers. To me, I think you could also read, if we're reading this in the literal sense, if he'd went at the 12th hour and the 15th hour, would he have needed more workers? I think he would have taken more workers there, but you're probably not working at the 12th and 15th hour because it's dark outside. So what's the main lesson here? No. Because think about it this way. Had you waited until the end of today to start working, you wouldn't have got to work, because that's when it started raining, right? It was nice all day, but if we wait until the end, we may miss out on it. I know. Yes.
I'm not a working tobacco, but I'm a good driver. Just driving instead of driving. And Melvin said, I don't need any drivers. I need somebody working tobacco.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of that. There's a lot of people that hear the gospel.
Yeah.
But I will come at my discretion,
right,
on my terms. Okay.
Right.
That's why you won't be chosen. Okay. I will come just for whatever reason at my time. And I think that's what this is right here.
Absolutely.
The wicked man turns from his ways, his evil ways will not be remembered. So it doesn't matter what time you come to Jesus, as long as you come to Jesus,
right,
you can be saved. You don't have to be raised in the church from the time you're a little kid and whatever. It doesn't matter, as long as you're willing to just repent of your evil ways, the reward will still be heaven.
Absolutely.
And one man said, well, nobody's hired us. Well, it could be the same thing. Maybe they didn't know, maybe they didn't know about it.
Mary. I think you're exactly right. Yes.
I think it's really very important to understand that God is not mocked. Whatever these guys, there's no indication that the Levi guys had
Right.
So if we say, well, I'm gonna wait till I'm 85, then I know what the gospel says, but I'm gonna live a life of right. But when I'm 85, I'm gonna hop on the bandwagon and go straight to heaven.
Right.
I'm not saying you can't be saved, but don't be playing games with God.
Right.
Okay? Because these guys were not playing games with God. They simply had not been hired. They had been approached and they did not know. So an opportunity came at whatever hour they took it.
Right.
Whether it was the very first, for instance, for me and for most of a lot of us, we became Christians very, very early age, okay? Because the opportunity was there. There's a lot of people that it's not there.
Right.
They've never been there. They've had terrible parents, terrible
Sure.
lives, and they made bad decisions, go out to jail, blah, 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 1,000 different things. Yeah. But I think with a sincere, good heart, though, you absolutely, the doors open for everybody.
So I want to talk about a couple of things here. I want to talk about work for just.
Before we do that, we see the first workers getting mad. We see that same parable with the prodigal son.
Mm-hmm.
And the Jews were getting upset mad because here they had to make it small, had to do all these rituals and rites and everything else. And here come the Christians, they kind of get a free pass from all that. And it's sometimes we want people to pay their dues.
Right.
We want them to have to suffer like we did. It's not supposed to be.
I've asked a couple of questions on purpose tonight because these parables, and I don't know if this is a real story or not, but I'm going to imagine that there's a lot of truth in the story because the parables that were taught were used to help facilitate learning for people. But all of us, 3/4 of us got mad about the pay right there off. We was already mad about it, right? And we already know what the story said. Like we can fall into that. And I think you're right because we look at the prodigal son story and say, oh man, what a great story. It's like the reality is a lot of us would have been like the son who was mad. It's like you giving him all this. We can fall into that fairly quick. So I want to talk about a couple of things, and I'll throw some questions out at you as well. This story is unique here to what Matthew writes here. The owner of the vineyard pays everyone a full day's wage. And as we've talked about, he goes out of his way to make sure everybody knows that they're all paid the same in spite of the number of hours that was worked. There was nothing hidden whenever he paid, right? They went straight out and said, you get $1 and you get $1, that kind of thing right there. And so not surprisingly, as we said, some of the people complained about that. They were upset that they didn't make more money or the other person didn't make less money as a result. Now, unlike the parable of the sower, which I think Jack Honeycutt talked about a few weeks ago, Jesus doesn't really give a real explicit explanation of this. You kind of have to interpret this on your own. A lot of times with the parables, Jesus just kind of stopped talking at the end, and it's almost like I took you this far. Now you got to figure out what I'm saying here. Why do you think that's the case? Why do you think Jesus? This is 16 verses. Why do you think there wasn't 18 verses in this parable where at the end Jesus said, now here's what it means? Right? I think so. Absolutely. Absolutely.
But I always thought about every 2 weeks, okay? Every 2 weeks, the post office gave me my check, okay?
Right.
That's what I was working for, okay? And they got their check too. I wasn't worried about their check.
Mm-hmm.
I was worried about Shelby Roy's check. As long as that check came every 2 weeks, I'm going to do that, okay? Because we had agreed to that.
Just taking all my points right there, just ripping one right out of the other. So because of the workers here, because this is kind of a work story, it's a lot of different interpretations. Remember, Jesus doesn't really give you a specific interpretation. So it opens up an opportunity for people to interpret it. And it sometimes seems like it says, we might could say that, well, don't compare your pay to other people, or don't be dissatisfied if others get paid more than you, or they work less, or do the similar job, or whatever. Now, it could be argued that we need to think about this as a worker, and maybe so. But the problem we have is if we're earning a decent wage, and they earned a day's wage, as Lucille said, if we're earning a decent wage, why make yourself miserable worrying about somebody else? And if we're not careful, we spend our time, man, I am working twice as hard as Jill, and I need to be making, and the whole time we're there at work, we're just madder than fire about what's happening. Can we fall into that trap pretty easy? That's just a work-related thing. Now, this is a story about Christianity. We'll get to that in a second. Then what were you going to say? Yes. Uh-huh. Absolutely. But we can't do that, can we? We fret far too much. Another interpretation, I'm not necessarily saying I agree with these things, but I'm just showing you some things of preparation for this. Said the parable could be used. Some people have used this to justify unfair payment. I don't think that's what Jesus is doing here at all. I don't think he's advocating that you should pay your laborers, certain the wrong amounts of money or whatever. That doesn't. There's nothing about Jesus that seems to imply anything like that. Also, paying people the same regardless of how much they do. If we're comparing this just to work, that's probably a questionable business practice, right? That's probably if we think this is a story about work, that's probably not the best incentive for people. They're not going to have a lot of incentivizing for that. If we're talking about money and work, what about making people's pay public? Let me give you an example. As a public employee, my pay is actually public. You can see what I make as a school teacher. You can see what everybody else makes in that department as well. And one time we had a guy who worked for us. I don't want to give too many details, but a guy that I worked with, he looked it up and he said, found that number. He said he makes whatever the amount of money was. It's more than us. He said he makes more than us, and he don't never come over here and help us. He fussed about that pay for like 6 months after that nonstop. I was like, what can you do about it? It's like you can't fix that. But if we get worked up about that, we're like overwhelmed by what it is. So if it's made public, it can clear things up, but sometimes it ends up making people all worked up, causing strife, getting people all concerned. And I don't think Jesus is advocating this as well. So what I think here, and this is maybe just be me, I don't think this is really about work. This parable is not a work parable. The context that we're seeing here talks about something different. We're talking about being a part of the kingdom of God, right? It's pretty clear to me, like if we look at this, Matthew chapter 19, children who legally don't even own themselves had access to the kingdom, right? Jesus said, don't keep the little ones from coming forward right there. Well, the little ones aren't working. They're not employees or anything like that. The kingdom doesn't belong to the rich, or at least not very many of them. What's the Bible say about a rich man? Few will go to heaven. Why? Trust those riches that they have. It belongs to all of those who follow him. And many will be first. It said many who are first will be last, who's last will be first. Entry into God's kingdom is not measured by the hour, right? It's not counted by that. We can't say, well, I've been a Christian for X number of years. Like Mom was saying a minute ago, I've been a Christian for 80 years. I get to go to the front of the line. You're new to this. You need to get behind me. Do we sometimes do that, though, in the church? None of it's earned. No, absolutely not. Yep.
Your heart has to get right.
Absolutely. Who's the vineyard owner? God. In this story, the vineyard owner is God. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10 that a worker is worthy of their food. They are worthy of their food. Does it say a good worker or a bad worker? We pass those judgments quite often, don't we? At the workplace, there are people that I know that are not very good at their job. But when I say that, I don't really know that. It's mostly anecdotal. It's mostly things the other kids have said to me. And the truth is, they may be walking down to math class saying, Mr. Hopkins is terrible at his job too. I mean, they may say anything like that. A lot of our knowledge, a lot of what we think about, like who's worthy, are judgments passed on things that we don't know anything about. Isn't it nice that God is the judge and not me? Because I'd line you straight up and I'd say, some of y'all been working awful hard, get up there in the front. Some of y'all maybe take another lap and we'll come back in a little bit later. That's the way we view things, but that's not the way that it's viewed by God. Now, no. Right.
We can work as hard as we want to. You can be working twice as hard as Bobby, but you ain't like that. There's some people are better with numbers, some people are better with patience.
Yep.
Some doctors are better with surgeons. That's just a fact. And we all have different talents.
So our lesson going in, and we're going to be done a little early tonight, so we can go out right in the rain here, as it were. If we read this story at surface level, how many of you here immediately think of the word unfair? We all do, right? We all do. Because so much of our life is dealing with things that this story can relate to. I think this is a good parable from Jesus because everybody can relate to the workplace, right? We can all relate to things that seem unfair and unjust in the workplace. This is 2,000 years ago, and it's still, the story worked even then. It works now just even as it did then. But a lot of life on earth can be described as unfair. How many things have happened to you in the last X number of years that are unfair? Well, they would make a lot of them, but some of them are probably more unfair than others, right? But in reality, a lot of the things that we said was unfair at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, we'd already forgot when we went to bed that night, right? We can get kind of worked up on that kind of stuff. Our kingdom is not of this what? World. Our kingdom's not of this world. Kingdom is of what? Our goal is to make it where? Our goal is to make it to heaven right there. So to make it to heaven, we got to answer the call of the guy who needs work in the vineyard, right? We took all the good answers right from the beginning. Because what if we don't answer that call? Let me ask you this. Original, 3rd hour, 6th hour, 9th hour, 11th hour. Every one of them got paid, right? What about the ones that didn't go? Probably a lot of people at that. I'd say there were people, I'm just assuming, but I'm just going to guess that there were probably people that there said, man, I hope that guy comes back tomorrow. I'd like to make a denarii. Tomorrow never came, right? If we're not careful, we have the same thing. So when's the right time to become a Christian? The right time was yesterday, but if it's not yesterday, it's absolutely today. When can we not guarantee? Can't guarantee tomorrow. And there's a million stories that tell you in the Bible that there's no guarantee of the next day. Now, I may be preaching to the choir here for a lot of people because we may already be Christians, but our decision has to be made based on the fact that we don't know when it's going to end. We don't know when it's going to come to a conclusion. But we do know that whether you started at the 11th hour or whether you started all the way back at the crack of dawn, you were paid the same thing. Isn't it nice to know that the heaven that we work for and that we aim for and that we strive for does not differentiate in what you get when you're there, right? There's no difference in what the prize is. What if there was? Would people be complaining about that too, wouldn't they? Would be constantly complaining. So I hope that we've taken from this question of fairness, and I really hope when we leave here that we stop saying things were unfair. I really hope that we'll stop saying that things are unfair because we look at fairness through whose eyes? Through our own, but there's a lot of other eyes that see things a lot of different ways. So that's my summation for us here tonight. Any other thoughts or anything before we go? Right.
Because if you do, this brings you down.
All right. Well, we would have probably lasted till 7, but y'all took all of my best points. Everything, just marking stuff out right and left up here. Don't need that. Don't need that. Don't need that. Y'all keep preparing yourself. Y'all keep coming with this kind of stuff. We'll be done by 6:15. We'll just finish the song and sing it again, and we'll go home after that. So, but I certainly do. We certainly appreciate your